Okay, now we've got a Hong Kong bind, and this is another really simple method of finishing off a seam, especially one that's going to be pressed open, so you don't have to have overlocking showing down both sides. And this tends to, even though it's got the bias on there, it tends to be a little bit flatter than the one where the overlocking is turned under and stitched, so you don't have the bulk of the overlocking. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew the seam first, and the reason we sew the seam first when we're doing this is because if you've got a long seam and you've got notches, if you bind the seams then you lose where the notches are and you don't have them to line up the seams. So sew the seam first and then we'll stitch on the binding. So this is a 1 centimeter seam again, and our 1 centimeter seam follows the down line on the 4. I know it's still a bit random, but just use that as a guide.
It's good you can't get metric plates.
Yes, all the plates that we have on the machines are all imperial measurements, so for the American market, exactly. Because America gets everything. Alright, so I've sewn it at 1 centimeter. You could press this open if you wanted to, but I'm a bit lazy, so I'm not.
Well, calico finger presses quite well.
Yeah, that's true.
So it probably depends on the fabric.
So here we're using, I've got this bias. This bias is going to be too wide for the complete finish, so I'm going to trim it off once we get it happening. So I've got the raw edge of the bias lined up with the raw edge of the seam allowance, and then both of those I've lined up with the edge of the foot here.
So it's probably about 5 millimeters, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is quite handy at times. Just do it that little bit narrower than the 6 mil.
So now, once you've done that, you can again give it a finger press or take it to the iron and press that seam back. And now we're just folding this under. And what we're going to do now is where you can stitch on top of the bind here if you find that's easier to do, but generally with a Hong Kong bind you actually stitch right next to it. So, and again, if you've got like a matching fabric and color that matches the bind, that matches the thread, generally it looks then like there's actually no stitching there at all, because the stitching is in the ditch and it seems to disappear. So, but yeah, if you wanted to have a contrast stitching on the Hong Kong bind, maybe you could stitch on top of the bias.
Get that binding sitting right up against the edge of the.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm doing as I go along is I'm really holding it so the fold sits right over those raw edges there. I'm just sort of like rolling it in with my fingers as I go along.
Yeah, so it sits nice and flat. You don't get it up against the edge, it tends to rope and do funny things.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so even there you can see, I've sewn it in black, and really even the black has pretty much disappeared. It just looks like the shadow there. So now you can see that when this is pressed open, you can see how that the binding is folded around because the binding's too wide for the actual seam allowance. And so to get rid of that, we then get our scissors, and I'd probably do it from this side.
Yeah, you don't cut anything you don't want to cut.
Yeah, so, and this I'm actually holding the seam allowance back there. So, and I'm just trimming it back.
Well, it's probably easier to do it after. If you make it really narrow, it's harder to work with. So.
Yeah, because it's on the bias, it can get a bit fiddly. So, if you have a wider one, and even then, like when I've folded that back, there's that one little spot there. Actually, it's a bit more than that.
It's probably easier to do with a small pair of scissors, but.
See, here you go. Yes, but they need to be fabric scissors though, they can't be paper scissors. So you can see there that, you know, like I can see the stitch line now, and then that's going to sit open. So I'll just press that open. And again, you know, like we said with the pin stitched one, if you're working with a thicker fabric, you can have a wider seam allowance. So, and that means too that if we had a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here, then I wouldn't have needed to trim this back on the inside. So yep, just see how you go, and then just repeat the same method down the other side. Give it a good press, and that's your bound seam with a Hong Kong bind.